Hello, my name is Caitlin, and my ecological question for my Bio 230 course is, does climate change affect polar bears in the Arctic, and if so, how much? Table of contents. So I will be talking about the introduction of polar bears, their feeding, reproduction, mortality, and its claims, the future effects, as well as a conclusion. Introduction of polar bears. Before I begin, I will be introducing a bit about polar bears. Polar bears were a terrestrial mammal that later became dependent on sea ice. They are perfectly adapted to the lifestyle of the Arctic on sea ice. In the spring, polar bears acquire as much energy as they can from hunting their favorite, seals. They need seals to replenish their fuel stores to allow them to sustain the long and dark winter. Polar bears' habitat, sea ice, is facing an unfortunate consequence. You may be wondering, why? Well, it's because of you and me, and basically the whole human population. Humans cause climate change, more specifically, global warming. Global warming causes negative effects on our polar bear population by its rapid decreasing of Arctic sea ice. This poses a severe threat to polar bears. It has been suggested that polar bears may go extinct in the near future if their ecosystem continues to increase in warm temperature. According to the International Panel of Climate Change, IPCC, the average global temperature is predicted to increase by 1.1 to 6.4 degrees Celsius during the 21st century. In addition, Effects of Climate Warming on Polar Bears, a review of the evidence by Ian S. and Andrew D. This figure shows the sea ice extent with respect to the years from the 1900s up to the predicted years of 2100. More specifically, looking at the red line shows direct observations made from satellite images. The red line shows a rapid decrease in sea ice that we are seeing today due to global warming. A key to understanding how global warming may affect polar bears is what my ecological question is about. Does climate change affect polar bears in the Arctic, and if so, how much? The feeding of polar bears. Polar bears play a huge ecological role in the Arctic ecosystem. Why, you may ask? Well, polar bears are the predators of the Arctic. Well, I was originally going to show you this food web I found online. However, I thought, why not make my own? In this diagram, it shows the Arctic food web, an example of an interaction chain as what we learned in lecture. Due to climate change, there are less polar bears due to their inability to hunt down seals. This leads to more seals and less Arctic cod as there is a higher demand for Arctic cod due to the many individuals of seals. With less Arctic cod, there will be more zooplankton or specifically copepods, which will lead to less phytoplankton, more microbial organisms or specifically flagellates, and less detritus or dead organisms overall. This effect is called a trophic cascade. Since polar bears are at a higher trophic level, this can be an example of biomagnification as what we learned in lecture, where polar bears consume prey with higher concentration of persistent organic pollutants, POPs, and heavy metals from organisms that they prey on. As briefly mentioned earlier, polar bears prey on seals, more specifically, ring seals and bearded seals. Some alternatives include that they prey on, but more unlikely are belugas, narwhals, walruses, other seals, birds, and fish. The spring is the most important season for polar bears, as seals are the most present during the period because it is the prime birthing season of those poor seals. Fortunately, for polar bears, they take advantage of this opportunity to feed on the ring seals and their pups in their birth layers on the sea ice, which are polar bears' prime hunting platform. With all this consumption, it will ensure the survival of polar bears throughout the rest of the year. However, due to climate change, the ice is slowly melting away, making it harder for polar bears to hunt. With more open water, seals may become less restricted in their need to maintain breathing holes and hollow sides, behavior of temporarily leaving the water. This will result in less predictable hunting and searching for polar bears. According to Polar Bears in a Warming Climate by authors Andrew D., Nicholas L., and Ian S., it was said that only rarely has a bear been reported to be able to capture a ring seal in open water. This means that the less sea ice there is, the harder it is for polar bears to feed on seals. Which leads to my example of interaction modification. I referred to our lecture notes and I made my own diagram. In this diagram, it refers to the indirect negative effect that sea ice has on seals. With more sea ice, it modifies the ability for polar bears to better capture seals. But due to climate change, there is less sea ice, resulting in an indirect positive effect that decreases the chances of polar bears hunting seals. The loss of sea ice will also affect polar bears in a different way. More specifically, on immature bears. Usually, adult bears consume the blubber of their prey and leave the protein behind. The young bears, as they don't have the skills to catch seals yet, they feed on the remains of kills from other bears. With less adult polar bears being able to catch prey, the immature bears will also be affected as there will be less food to scavenge. On the flip side, an alternative of prey choice could be walruses. Even if they are a minor prey species of polar bears, they would be vulnerable to the predation of polar bears. The loss of sea ice is a possible benefit to some polar bears as they will be able to access walrus haul-out sites and be able to predictably kill walruses because walruses would be forced to concentrate in smaller areas. However, adult male polar bears may be only able to prey on walruses due to the large size of walruses. In conjunction, walruses are actually smart enough and are capable of threatening and possibly killing polar bears themselves, which is pretty ironic seeing as polar bears are seen as the predators of the Arctic. The reproduction of polar bears. Polar bears are sexually dimorphic species, meaning that they represent two distinct forms. Males having about twice the mass of females, the male on the right and the female on the left. From March through May, it is time for breeding season to begin. Polar bears undergo sexual reproduction. Although it is super costly with the amount of time and energy put into it, sexual reproduction allows the mixing of genes. As mentioned in lecture, this enhances a higher chance of survival with pathogens and parasites in future generations. Fertilization happens during the fall season, in which the female will enter a den. The den is usually dug in the snow on a steep hillside on land not far from the sea. The mama bears give birth to 1 to 3 cubs between late November and early January, and they keep their offspring for around 2.5 years, thus breeding every 3 years. When talking about trade-offs in lecture, polar bear births would be a great example. Since the mother produces a few cubs, this allows her to put more energy into maintaining their survival. Whereas if the mother produces, let's say, 20 cubs, hypothetically of course, she has to put more energy into reproduction, thus leading to a less likely chance of survival of the cubs. Tying in the loss of sea ice, there has been a link with body mass and sea ice breakup. When female polar bears have a less than a critical mass of around 189 kilograms in the fall, she will be unable to reproduce successfully. According to Effects of Climate Change of Polar Bears, a review of the evidence by Ian S. and Andrew D. This figure shows the sea ice breakup time of year with respect to the years 1979 through 2007. The dashed line indicates the negative relationship of sea ice breakup as time goes by. Similarly, with the same article, shows another figure of the mean body mass in kilograms of adult female polar bears with respect to the years from 1980 through 2007. The dashed line indicates the negative relationship of a declining body mass as time goes by. Altogether, this shows that the declining sea ice breakup, there is a decline in body mass in adult females. This means that there are less and less successful reproductions. Mortality of polar bears. A fun but unfortunate fact about the mortality rate of polar bear cubs is generally high. Depending on the subpopulation, cubs have a 34% survival rate, which is half as high as the adult individual. Some cubs may die from starvation, as mentioned earlier, because of the decrease in adult polar bear predation, hypothermia, drowning, or the most unfortunate of them all, killed by adult male polar bears. The general lifespan of a wild roaming polar bear is around 30 years. Part of their culture, indigenous peoples living in Alaska, Canada, and Greenland hunt for polar bears as a source of food and warmth. Unfortunately, around 800 polar bears are killed per year, which is 3 to 4% of the estimated total population. Global warming has caused more unusual rain events. An unfortunate documented instance explained that the rain caused the roof of a den to collapse, killing the mother and her cubs. According to Effects of Climate Change on Polar Bears, a review of the evidence by Ian S. and Andrew D. This image shows an adult female polar bear that was crushed due to a collapsed maternity den with her and her 2 cubs. It was also documented that polar bears drown in open water due to the loss of sea ice. An instance witnessed 4 polar bears drowning because of global warming. It is hypothesized that future mortality will be caused by open water drowning as a result of the increase in warming. Additionally, cubs that must follow their mother over long stretches of open water to get to their better and suitable habitat are most likely to suffer from fatigue or drowning because of the loss of sea ice. Another document confirmed instances of intraspecific predation and cannibalism in polar bears, specifically in Beaufort Sea. Intraspecific predation, as what we learned in lecture, is the same species trophic interaction in which an individual of one species, the predator, consumes some or all of an individual of another species, the prey. And this is an act of carnivory, as both predator and prey are animals. Summarizing the loss of sea ice talked about earlier, this has caused polar bear mortality to increase because of a shortened feeding time in the spring, meaning a longer fasting season in a leaner condition than before, as body mass is declining through time. Another factor that may be increasing mortality rates is that due to global warming, more polar bears are closer to land. This causes the availability of polar bears to human hunters on land. As well, more human to polar bear interactions cause more polar bears killed because of self-defense. More specifically, 10 polar bears per year in Alaska. On the other hand, boating is extended to a longer season due to the loss of sea ice, which causes more human hunters to hunt polar bears on boat. According to Effects of Climate Change on Polar Bears by Austin W., John A., and Eric B., there is a 5% increase in polar bears shot on a boat compared to sled trips on land between 1983 to 1991, to 30% in 1994 to 1999 in northeast Greenland. Fortunately for the polar bear population, quotas have been implemented since 2006 in Greenland to save these vulnerable Arctic species. With respect to what we learned in lecture, the interaction between humans, polar bears, and seals is a great example of competitive hierarchy. In this diagram that I created, it shows that humans are at the top of the hierarchy as we hunt polar bears as well as seals, and polar bears hunt seals, putting seals at the bottom of this hierarchy. Claims. In 2005, the IUCN Polar Bear Specialist Group concluded that during the next 35 to 50 years, it is expected that there will be a 30% decrease in the total polar bear population because of the loss of sea ice. In 2006, polar bears were listed as a threatened species on the IUCN Red List. In 2007, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called on external experts in climate change and polar bears to evaluate the status of polar bears to the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and that they should be protected as a threatened species. In 2008, polar bears were listed as threatened. Future effects of polar bears. If climate change continues to decrease sea ice cover and cause more sea ice breakup, it will cause delineation of subpopulations of polar bears, as we talked about in lecture. This may lead to geographic isolation, in which characteristics in one subpopulation will be different compared to another subpopulation that was affected by this isolation. As global warming continues to warm our planet, this has a direct effect of the loss of sea ice habitat for polar bears and an indirect effect of prey availability and type. With all the changes happening, it has been suggested that if sufficient ecological changes occur, polar bears may become extinct, as they are a very vulnerable species. As talked about in lecture with special guest Mia Waters, she shared with us this diagram, and I thought it was super interesting and I had to bring it up. The main habitat for polar bears is the Arctic or the polar region. So looking at the polar roll at the very bottom of the diagram and the climate change column, we can see that the box is an up arrow surrounded by an orange box. Looking at the legend on the bottom, it describes that the polar bear region, with respect to climate change, has had a very rapid increase of impact with high diversity over the last century. This shows that the polar bear habitat is in danger for future changes, as its ecosystem has already had impacts in biodiversity. Leading to the big question, can polar bears adapt to global warming? It has been proposed that polar bears may adapt to climate warming by using more terrestrial resources rather than marine resources such as berries, seaweed, sea ducks, or bird eggs. According to low variation in blood delta carbon 13 among Hudson Bay polar bears, implications for metabolism and tracing terrestrial foraging by Keith H. and Ian S. This has been seen during the ice-free period of late summer and fall in western Hudson Bay. The use of snow geese and thick-billed mer eggs and chicks have been postulated with climate change, but the predation of these eggs have been known since the 1900s. This proves that this behavior of adapting to terrestrial ecosystems is a result of the ecosystem change of their primary habitat, the Arctic. According to comments in response to estimating the energetic contribution of polar bear, Arsis maritimus, Summer Diets to the Total Energy Budget by Dick and Kibrebe, by Karen R., James R., Elizabeth P., and Ian S., a rebuttal article states that while polar bears consume a variety of terrestrial and freshwater food sources opportunistically, it is considered inadequate energy that polar bears are consuming. To sum it up, polar bears have a simple and short gastrointestinal tract and are not adapted to efficient digestion of vegetation. Polar bears are marine predators and are highly specialized in acquiring prey like seals, and not vegetation or other terrestrial food sources. Their survival is dependent on the access of the seal population in the Arctic, and with climate change in place, the lives of polar bears are declining, like all the facts that have been presented in this video. The conclusion of this whole video. My ecological question states, does climate change affect polar bears in the Arctic? And if so, how much? Yes, climate change does affect polar bears in the Arctic. Specifically, global warming affects the sea ice, which is the habitat and transportation platform of polar bears. Polar bears rely on sea ice cover for feeding, reproduction, and mortality. Feeding is affected because it is more difficult to catch prey. Reproduction is affected because with less food means a smaller body mass and less energy, making reproductions less successful. Mortality is affected because with less food, polar bears may starve, or with climate change, maternity dens are collapsing. These factors are evidence that climate change really does have a dramatic effect on the polar bear population. With all that humans are contributing to climate change, the polar bear population will become extinct in the near future if we don't act and change now. What you can do to save our planet from climate change, or better yet, save the polar bears, is to use renewable sources of energy such as solar and wind energy to power your homes, or you can drive electric cars, take public transportation, or bike. It is as simple as that. Save the polar bears! Thank you for listening.